Hi everyone, this is going to be my first video here during the coronavirus epoch of our class, which, according to information we received yesterday from President Crow, is going to go on to the end of the semester. So while we're doing this, while we're in this sort of mode, what I'll be doing is just trying to answer your questions. As I said on that announcement, that video announcement, do look at the video announcements if you haven't already. For important news about the midterm as well, which will go ahead as planned this week on Thursday, I think in your case. I'm going to answer questions. I'm going to sort of discuss questions that you've made in a way that we did in class, except there'll be less input from you, unfortunately, which was really a lot of what we were doing, a lot of the good stuff. So I'll discuss these questions. I'll sort of answer them as best I can. But yeah, let's do this. I've got the book open in front of me because what I want to do first is answer this question. If I can get to it. It says here, can someone give me an example of feminist theory as it relates to IR? More importantly, what is the importance of feminist theory as an effective approach to IR? So I think it's a good one to get started with. And I think I took this, took the sort of example thing very specifically, very literally, and I looked page 89 in the book. We get this example of empirical IR, feminist work. Empirical feminist work. So there's a couple of things, probably maybe a more theoretical approach, more of a critical approach, which I think is where Antigone starts with her first book, where feminist scholars are looking at the discipline of IR and talking about how it's gendered. How do they know it's gendered? How did it come to be gendered? Those sorts of more of a critical approach, right? So looking at IR scholarship and critiquing it, judging it, and talking about how it might be masculine or how it depends on a gender, on gender, right? For its work. So that might be more of a critical approach, maybe more of a theoretical approach. And then, but when she comes to discuss the empirical work, right? So this is now. So one, I suppose one application of feminist theory is a critique of international race, and from that we get the we get that the activity that she does with her class, where she writes down the list of attributes, logical, strong, decisive, those sorts of things, and they get gendered. Students can identify those as masculine traits, right? And even though most of the students in a class are women, nevertheless they identify with those masculine traits, and so it's a simple experiment, but it's an effective one, and it's illustrative, right, of the approach that Antigone begins with, I think, and it's illustrative of this sort of critique, this feminist critique of international relations. That it's a gendered discipline. It's gendered masculine, and so then that leads to sort of a, what if it wasn't gendered masculine? What if how would it be different if it was if some femininity were brought into the discipline? How would that change the discipline, right? So that's the one approach. The empirical approach here, we've got some quite solid examples of what's next, and I think they call this the second stage or the second wave within international relations, feminism within international relations. It said, okay, we've critiqued the discipline now, so let's now start to add some femininity into the discipline. Let's try and add, and there's different ways to do that, right? One of the ways to do that is to sort of look at the effect that international relations have, war, conflict, diplomacy. What sort of effect does that have on women, and how do women affect that? Right, so those are some empirical questions, and we can obviously drill down to more specifics than that, and that's what I'll do. I'll point to page 89 and the list of examples that Antigone gives us. A lot of the empirical IR feminist work that's now coming out is grounded in the real world. There's a question about that we'll deal with next. Grounded in the real world, or maybe we should talk about multiple real worlds, since the worlds that feminists are writing about have frequently been hidden from the agendas of international politics. Right. So this is again sort of a general rule for the contribution of feminist IR, that there's some areas of international politics that have been hidden, that haven't been dealt with by mainstream international relations, that haven't been looked at. And so let's look at them, right? As feminists, let's look at those areas, right? They're often to do with gender and probably particularly with women, right? Although, anyway, let's carry on. Hidden, so frequently being hidden from the agendas of international politics. Take Cathy Moon's book, which talks about military prostitution in Korea. Right, so this is a specific example, right, of an empirical work produced by Feminist IR. Talks about military prostitution in Korea. Or Elizabeth Prugel's work on home-based labor. Jackie True has just finished a book on the effects of women of the post-communist transition in the Czech Republic. Right, so a lot of work, especially in the 90s, right, was done on the transition in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, from communism to capitalism, right? All sorts of work, and you can imagine. I'll ask you now. When I guess I've just read that, so this might affect the answers to the question. But if forget what I just said, and then ask yourself, if somebody says, hey, here's a book about the transition from communism to capitalism in Eastern Europe, you may or may not be interested to read it, but what are you going to expect to find in that book? I would say I would probably expect to find sort of economic theory, right? Economic growth, probably like relationships, diplomatic relationships with the West. I would think about maybe NGOs coming in there from the United States and to help and to support this. I'd probably go to military relations and maybe downgrading of weapon systems. I think of Ukraine giving back its nuclear weapons, right? That's a big thing. So I might not think about how that affected women, right? The effects on women of the post-communist transition in the Czech Republic, right? That wouldn't be top of my list. That wouldn't be top of the things that I would think about. And is that, I suppose, right? That's because that's what the work on post-communist transition, I think, focuses on, right? That's what we hear about. That's what we read about. And so there's this whole other area, right, about women, oftentimes about women, but not always, but oftentimes about women, that might have been overlooked, right, and that feminists want to put back into the picture because it's a part of the real world, right? It's part of the world, and it's part of international politics and part of international relations. So shouldn't we study that too? So that's that just small section in 89 there. And I want to go on to the next paragraph a little bit, just to sort of start to answer the second question. And Antigonus states, a lot of the empirical IR feminist work that's now coming out is grounded in the real world. Remember, we said there was a question about that. She then uses the example of military prostitution in Korea, right, which we just talked about. I don't understand the use of the word real world when talking about military prostitution in Korea. Okay, so first of all, I should say I'm not an expert on military prostitution in Korea. I haven't read this work, but I'll talk about the real world here, because that's something that's I think quite important to feminist IR theory. And it probably, right, it's probably a little bit of a swipe at the realists, right? When we think about the realists and just the name of the realists, right? The claims that they make about studying the world as it is, right? We're going to strip back any talk of morality, right, or any talk of intentions, right? Those things are not real. They're not dependable. We're just going to look at the the thing that's real is interest defined as power. Power is the thing that's real, right? How many tanks has this guy got, right? That's what's real. And so a feminist critique of international relations is, hey, there's other things that are real too that you're not focusing on. Women are real, right? Prostitution in Korea is real. Home workers in the world that are mostly women, in sort of informal workers, they're real. That's really happening. And so I think talking about the real world, it's a critique of mainstream international relations and sort of a reminder that that realism in particular, but all mainstream international relations, and remember when we said mainstream international relations, we said realism, liberalism, and probably parts of constructivism as well. Feminism's definitely outside, like Marxism is, and lots of constructivism. Feminism lies outside of the mainstream. It's fair to say. So, but this talk of the real world, right, is important because it says, look, you mainstream IR people who are trying to focus on reality in the real world, you have a very narrow focus, and it's sort of a masculine focus. And there's another half of the world out here, right? Not just that we're looking at women, but feminine things generally, right? Things that might be gendered feminine. Sort of, I guess it goes back to the beginning of Antigna's reading, where she's talking about when she first starts teaching, right? And she says that there's a heavy emphasis on the Cold War, so there was a heavy emphasis. Sorry, this was during the Cold War, so there was a heavy emphasis on security issues and nuclear strategy, right? Things like first strike, second strike, how to hide the nuclear weapons, and so to enable them to survive a first strike, so you can strike back, so that you can deter attacks from other countries. And she says, I noticed that a number of my female students would come to my office hours and say, I'm just not cut out for this sort of stuff. When I asked them to explain why, they'd come down to the fact that they thought male students were somehow more qualified to talk about weapons and military strategy, right? Weapons, military strategy, to Antigna's students seem to be gendered masculine, right? They seem to be for men. And that's not to say that all men are masculine, right? That's certainly not what Antigna thinks. At the bottom of page 89, you'll see that as well, right? Another problem is that gender is always equated with women. We must understand that gender is about men and masculinity, something that's central to international politics, and so much of the discipline is about men and masculinity, right? So, it's not like the feminists would ask us to be careful, right? And not to imagine that, sort of the mainstream of international relations is just gender neutral. It's just they say, no, that's gendered too. That's masculine. Right, this talk about military strategy and weapons like nuclear weapons, that's masculine, right? And so you're only looking at part of the real world, right? And so, hey, let's look at these other parts of the real world. And the other thing that I think about when it comes to real world is just the division that I talked about earlier, right, between sort of a more critical, critical, maybe more theoretical approach to international relations versus a more empirical approach where we're looking at practices. Practices on the top of page 89. We talk about that. How do people really live their lives? How do women and men go about their daily lives, and how do international relations affect that, right? And how does that affect international relations? To sort of build theory from practice. Right, which it says here, I think, however, many IR theorists don't think that that's a legitimate way to build knowledge, right? It's not a legitimate way to build knowledge, to look at daily practices of groups of people sort of living their lives and sort of build up from there to some sort of generalizable theory. Feminists might be inclined, some feminists, lots of feminists, maybe generally feminism is inclined to do that, right? To look at the lives of, in particular, women probably, right? And sort of build international political theory from there, as opposed to, I suppose, maybe a top-down approach. What would that look like? I suppose, when I say top-down, I'm thinking of something called high politics. This idea that some things like war, diplomacy, the UN, these things happen at some sort of a higher plane, right? This is sort of a vertical model of world politics where you and me living our lives here trying to avoid the coronavirus inside, we're sort of down low, but up high. If we look above us, we don't see the sky, but we see, I don't know, President Trump with the CDC. Right above them, we see the sort of World Health Organization. Right, it's like a vertical, and so international politics should be the mainstream of IR might just focus up there. Right, Donald Trump might be the lowest they go in the CDC, whereas higher than that, right, the World Health Organization, you know. Sort of interstate conflict up there to diplomacy, but the real world, it's just as real here, where you and I are, right? This is just as real as that is, right? And so why do we have to start there? Why not start down here and build international political thought from here? And certainly feminists generally will want to do that, perhaps because and feminism isn't just about women, right? It's about men too, but as it explains on page 89. But that from my perspective, I suppose I would say, it seems like feminism might be more inclined to sort of look at the real world as the world where you and I inhabit down here, well below the international organizations and the nation states. Maybe because there aren't as many women participating up there. The women participating down here. That might be one reason. The other reason might be some sort of an emancipatory cognitive interest. This is a Habermasian theory about why do people learn things, right? Why do we learn things? You've got the technical cognitive interest, which is, hey, we learn things so that we can control, right? So I don't know, I often think about engineering when I think about technical cognitive interest, probably just because of the word technical, which is probably unfair. But we learn engineering because we want to control the world around us. We want to be able to control the flow of water, decide where it goes and how fast it goes, and I don't know what else we study about water, right? But maybe the minerals that it contains. We want to control all those things, the cleanliness of it, the drinkability of it. We want to control all those things in various stages of the water cycle. And so we learn engineering, and that's because we have a technical cognitive interest. We want to be able to control the natural world, and so we learn engineering. The second one, I always forget the name of it, hermeneutics, right? Basically, I think Habermas has a different name for it though. But the idea behind that, the second cognitive interest, is that we want just to understand it. And so if you think of I always think of anthropology as an example for this. So we go to, in the 19th century, right? We go out into the jungle, out into the wilderness, and we find these tribes who've been living without any sort of contact with the outside world, and we go there not because we want to control them. In fact, in the 19th century, as anthropologists, we probably don't want to control them. What we probably want to do, what we imagine we can do in the 19th century, is go there and be sort of a fly on the wall and just observe and just understand their language. We learn their language, their customs, as they do them without any sort of outside interference, as they've always done them. We want to sort of describe and just understand them. That's enough. We don't want to direct them or make them like the water to flow this way or that way. We just want to experience their different culture. So that's the second one, which we call hermeneutics, but I don't know if it's just the hermeneutic cognitive interest. I think there's a different name for it that I often forget. The third one, and this is the one that's really, I think, relevant to feminism, right, is this idea of an emancipatory cognitive interest. And this emancipatory cognitive interest is the idea that, I suppose, the truth will make you free, right? That knowledge, knowledge of systems, knowledge of the way things work, knowing the systems, knowing oppressive systems and what they're based on, allows us to sort of free ourselves from them. and so that I think is the tradition. That's the cognitive interest that feminism sort of lies in, right? Feminism in international relations, at least, that you know, there's some sort of an oppression of the feminine, not just women, but feminine things that are gendered feminine, and particularly in international relations, which is heavily sort of biased towards masculinity, heavily involved in masculinity, and that by understanding that, first of all, by understanding how that oppression or that link works, right? How international relations is masculine, then that can sort of free the other side, the feminine side, and sort of give voice to it, right, where it didn't have a voice before. So I think that's and that sort of cognitive interest in emancipation, that lends itself then to, I think, studying the lives of ordinary people, of people down here in the real world, right? Not the real world of the UN, right? Which is not real, you know, or it's just as real, right, as your life and my life. So, yeah, that's a fair amount of detail, I think, that I hadn't planned on going in, but hopefully that helps answer that question a little bit. I'm going to go on to a couple more questions here. Okay, so was Antigone the first woman to really push for feminist theory in international relations, or was she one of many, since she stated that feminism in IR took off the same time as the women's movement in the 60s and 70s? I think it's fair and right and just to see Antigone as the first woman to look at feminism as it relates to international relations. That's certainly her claim. That's a claim that's sort of understood by most international relations scholars as well. She would be seen as the first. I think she does say in one of her pieces, right, that she sort of gives credit to, I think, some scholars in Britain and perhaps Australia too, that maybe started around the same sort of time, right, and that she was able to meet with and collaborate with. But certainly she says that she wrote the first. She claims that, right? My book, Gender in International Relations, right from the title, it seems like that might be the first one, right? Gender in International Relations was the first singly authored feminist text that critiqued the discipline from a gendered perspective. Right? So I think the answer is yes. I think it would be impossible to overestimate the influence that Antigone has had on feminism in international relations. Sort of leave that at that. That's quite an easy one to answer, I think. And then I'll finish with this last question. I don't know how long we've gone on for at this point. Let me see. It might be quite long. I often find myself going a little bit longer than I really expected to go. I've got 23 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to start wrapping it up a little bit, but let me wrap it up by answering this. What's the end goal or purpose of feminism in regards to international relations? I think that's a good question too. Where are we going here? I think I already gave away part of the answer when I talked about those cognitive interests. Right? There's this emancipatory cognitive interest. Also, when I talked about this idea of the real world, I don't know. So Antigone talks a couple of times about the being accepted by the mainstream, right? And she says, "Oh, I'm glad that you think that we're accepted by the mainstream." I wonder, and we talked about this a lot during my graduate student days. Do those theories that we've talked about that are on the outside, the outskirts of international relations, are they better off being adopted and adapted into the mainstream or not? And certainly there's an argument against the benefit of that, right? Because of course, if you're trying to critique a mainstream, to be co-opted by the mainstream, and there was Cohen, I think it was, pretty sure it was. You might be able to find this article if you look on Google Scholar or something. But when feminism is first getting started, he comes out with this great article about how sort of setting the limits for feminism, saying, yeah, welcome in. Here's what you can do. Here's your job. Here's the job of feminism, which of course didn't go down very well with the feminists, right? But and so there's a response to him. Is it Cindy Weber that responds to him? Anyway, I think so. But if you can find that, if anybody wants me to have a better look and to find the two articles where Cohen, I'm pretty certain it's Cohen, is saying, "Oh, welcome feminism, welcome to the mainstream. Here's your job." You can, and he says something like, you guys can look at the, when we're looking at variables, you can, whenever like gender's a variable, whenever women are sort of a variable, you can do that sort of thing, right? And that'll help mainstream international relations. And there was, the reaction against that is like, you know, uh, who are you to tell us, right? Who are you to tell us? Here's this mainstream international relations masculine-oriented scholar dictating to women and to feminism, to feminist international relations, what sort of role they're allowed to play. And so the reason why I bring that up is because is the price of admission into the mainstream, right? Is the price of admission into the mainstream sort of an acceptance of the masculine focus of the discipline? In which case, for feminism to join the mainstream would be ultimately like a loss of feminism, right? It would be because the very thing that it's there to critique would be something that sort of co-opted it. And so, in that sense, the goal might not be to be accepted by the mainstream. Right? But of course, feminist IR scholars, like any other scholars, want I assume the majority of them want recognition of their work, right? Recognition of their peers, that their work is good work and valuable work. They probably, I think Antigone alludes to this in one of the readings that we did. They want to be included in introductions to the discipline, like the introduction that we're doing now. And there is a couple. There was one question that I haven't got to, but it was talking about, hey, like, why don't teachers in these classes teach more women international relations scholars, right? And I took that personally in a good way. I took it personally, right? That, hey, why don't I, right? And the short answer is, I mean, it's probably not that short, right? But this is that the reader that I've chosen, which is a very good reader, right? It has some readings here from women, but very few. And I think if you had other books, if we used other books, there might be zero. I've taught this class a few times in various guises, I suppose. I've used this book for a while, and I remember a graduate student using this book in a graduate class that I taught at Thunderbird, and I remember one of the women coming to me at the end and saying, "I had no idea there's any such thing as feminist IR." I don't know if you're in the same boat, but this was a woman who had studied international relations, right? She'd got a degree, and now she's pursuing a graduate degree, and still hadn't heard of it, right? So, so in terms of an end goal, there's sort of maybe not adoption sort of by the mainstream, and not a co-option by the mainstream, but maybe more recognition and greater, I suppose, greater knowledge to have contributed to the education and to the knowledge base generally in the world, I suppose, is one for women's issues to have some sort of, for feminine issues, not just women's issues, but feminine issues to have, or even maybe gendered issues, right? Maybe a gendering of international relations, like an acknowledgement that yes, up to this point it has been masculine, right? It's excluded feminine, femininity, I suppose. I'm trying for want of words. Femininity, it's excluded femininity. It's been focused on masculine issues. That I suppose would be an end goal too for feminism. And do we ask the same about realism? What's the end goal of realism? Because in a lot of ways it will be probably similar, right? What's the end goal of liberalism? What's the end goal of, and of course, the end goal, I guess, coming back to realism, right? The end goal for feminism might be survival, right? the survival of feminist scholars, right? Their placement at good universities, good political science departments, their ability to mentor and to bring up future scholars, future IR scholars, to influence them. That seems to be, to me, to be something that we get from realism, right, in nation states, but something that absolutely applies to every field, subfield, niche within a subfield, every theoretical approach. It wants to survive. It wants to carry on to the next generation. And I couldn't imagine that feminism is any different in that respect. So yeah, a few questions. I hope this was useful to you and interesting to you. I think it does give you a strong basis for a paper, right, that might come up on the midterm for on feminism. If one of these questions became one of your options for the midterm, I think what I've said gives you quite a strong basis. But of course, lots of what I've said I think is based in the readings that we've done, and some of the other readings that I've done previously, and so that's obviously the main should be the main focus for you, is understanding what Antigona's is saying here in both of these readings, and being able to use it in questions. I just come across this. Well, I could read the whole thing back to you. I won't though. You have it. So go ahead, and I'll finish that there now.